Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all again. We're very happy to be here today in yet another session of our seminar series, Topics in Early Modern Studies. As usual, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you the house rules. Please keep your microphones muted during the entire talk. After the presentation, we will have time for questions. I would also ask you to either write your questions in the chat or use the raise hand function to let us know that you'd like to speak, whichever you feel most comfortable with. When writing in the chat, please feel free to make your questions in English, Portuguese, Spanish, or French. Finally, I would also like to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later, probably on the second semester. Having that said, we're happy to welcome today Professor Mayte Green-Mercado. Professor Green-Mercado received her Bachelor in European History at the University of Puerto Rico and proceeded to obtaining her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, specializing in Islamic Studies. She is an associate professor in the Faculty of History at Rutgers University, and she is the director of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies minor in the History Department. She is the author of Visions of Deliverance, Moriscos and the Politics of Prophecy in Early Modern Mediterranean, and her current book project is concerned with histories of displacement, migration, and refugees in the early modern Mediterranean. The paper she will be presenting today is titled Visions of Loss and Restoration, Moriscos, Conversos, and the Circulation of Iberian Apocalyptic Narratives in the Early 17th Century. So thank you very much, Professor Green-Mercado, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lívia, for the presentation, and Verônica for inviting me today, and all of you for being here. Today, I will be talking about a subject related to the book that I published recently, but I will present some material that didn't make it into the book, and it is material that some parts of it are rather new to me and my work. And so I really appreciate any feedback or ideas that you might have as I am developing this project. I will share my screen and show a little PowerPoint presentation, and I will be reading a text. So let me first... No, I have to, sorry, this is a bit confusing. I'm not used to Google Meet, so, okay, I'm sharing my screen. And let's see, can you see?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yes, you can, okay. So, the title of this talk is Visions of Loss and Restoration, Moriscos, Conversos, and the Circulation of Iberian Apocalyptic Narratives in the early 17th century. And as I said, this is new material, but really old material. I started doing research for my dissertation about 20 years ago, and this was material that didn't end up in the book, so it's kind of nice to go back and look at this material that I had really worked on possibly in 2004 or 2005. Beliefs in the end times are at the heart of early modern Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thought. Evolving in all three monotheistic faiths as a multifaceted practice that was at once social, intellectual, and political, these beliefs constituted a cornerstone of public life in early modernity, a period often defined by the rise of centralizing and expanding imperial entities with territorial and hegemonic ambitions. Inasmuch as beliefs in the end times addressed questions such as the meaning of redemption and claims to universal sovereignty, the apocalyptic prophecies and prognostications that articulated many of these ideas were elaborated along the fault lines of interconfessional polemics as well as imperial conflict. In the context of the Mediterranean, where competing polities and empires, the Spanish Habsburgs, the French, the Venetians, the Ottomans, the Saadis in Morocco, fought their ideological and military battles for universal sovereignty, apocalyptic prophecies served, as Sanjay Subrahmanyam has pointed out, as building blocks of early modern imperial state formation. At the same time, excuse me, apocalyptic prophecies and prognostications were not solely the discursive paradigms that shaped novel imperial agendas, but they were also instruments of new dispensations for non-imperial and non-state actors. As such, beliefs concerning the end times constituted a cornerstone in the authoritative narratives through which new forms of political and communal identities were forged and reinforced. Today, I would like to focus on one example of such apocalyptic prophecies that circulated among new Christians of early modern Iberia. And here I'm referring to Conversos, or Jewish converts to Catholicism, and Moriscos, former Muslims who were forcibly converted to Catholicism in the early 16th century. This example reveals the imbricated nature of Iberian apocalyptic ideas. Yet while it might be tempting to view these early modern apocalyptic ideas in terms of syncretism or mestizaje, today I will argue that this knowledge inflected the Moriscos and Conversos ideas, hopes, and aspirations for the political future of the Iberian Peninsula and for the survival of their particular communities. I will focus my discussion today on a case study drawn from an inquisitorial dossier produced by the Tribunal of the Inquisition of Toledo, Spain, between 1605 and 1610. The case involves a Portuguese converso doctor named Felipe de Nájera, resident in the town of Argamasilla de Albas in La Mancha, Castile. Nájera was being investigated for following the law of Moses, that is, for Judaizing, returning to the old faith of his ancestors. Witnesses claimed that the man had never been seen steeped in prayer, that he owned an old and tattered rosary whose unstrung beads he had never cared to repair, and they recalled certain nefarious things that Nájera had allegedly done to some images of Christ and the Virgin. Other witnesses stated that the converso had attempted to secure some books written by Jewish authors, including one by a certain Isaac Hebreo, most likely the 9th-10th century North African Jewish physician known as Isaac Israeli ben Salomon, who authored various medical and philosophical treatises on Neoplatonism that were later translated from Arabic into Hebrew, Latin, and Spanish, entering the medical curriculum of universities in medieval Europe. He was also interested in the works of a Portuguese Jew, Leon Hebreo, or Judah Abravanel, born in Lisbon in 1460 and died in Naples in 1530. Judah was the son of the famous financier of Ferdinand and Isabella, and also renowned theologian and biblical commentator Don Isaac Abravanel. And I should mention that Isaac Abravanel was also well known for his ideas concerning the advent of the Messiah, and that he saw in the Ottomans the messianic force that would battle against Christians, conquer Rome, and ultimately win the battle of the end of times. The book that Nájera was trying to acquire was likely Leon Hebreo's famous Neoplatonic treatise on love, rendered in Italian as Dialoghi di Amore. Other accusations were more personal in nature, and they included the charge of pecado nefando, or sodomy. I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second, and sorry, because I just don't want to keep a black screen, you all looking at a black screen. Other accusations were more personal in nature, and they included the charge of pecado nefando, or sodomy. I would like, however, to center my attention on the testimony of a 25-year-old Morisco doctor named Juan de Toledo, who was jailed in the Inquisition and accused of sorcery, and who happened to be Nájera's Inquisition cellmate. There is no doubt that Juan de Toledo was testifying against his cellmate in order to ingratiate himself with the inquisitors by demonstrating his unwavering affiliation to the Christian faith. The problematic nature of this source notwithstanding, this Morisco's testimony is valuable in many respects. For example, it gives detailed information about the organization of converso networks between the Iberian Peninsula, France, Germany, and as far as Cairo. It also mentions the existence of a common fund that was collected to aid conversos who attempted to cross the border into France. And it even suggests connections between Moriscos and conversos who collaborated in these crossings. Today, however, I will focus on a different kind of knowledge exchanged between the two men. Information that sheds light on the beliefs of conversos and Moriscos concerning the end of times. The knowledge that Felipe de Nájera shared with his Morisco cellmate, it was firmly rooted in biblical prophecies and also in Christian apocalyptic narratives that circulated in the Iberian Peninsula, at least since the 4th century. And here I will share again, sorry. According to the young Morisco doctor, Nájera used to recite the prophecies of the Portuguese shoemaker prophet Antonio Gonçalves Anes Bandarra, whose verse prognostications influenced Portuguese imperial messianism throughout the 16th century. Nájera knew them by heart because he had heard them in his native town of Trancoso, the birthplace of the famous prophet. Bandarras's verses, with their scathing criticism of the corrupt clergy, had become popular in the 1540s, and after the defeat of the Portuguese at the Battle of the Three Kings, or Alcázar in 1578, they were interpreted in a messianic key. According to this novel reading, the Portuguese king Don Sebastián did not die in battle with the Moroccan Sultan, but had rather gone into hiding, encoberto, but would return as a messianic king to restore the Portuguese monarchy. The shoemaker's prophecies were popular among the Portuguese converso Jews, and it was Bandarras's proximity to the conversos that landed him in the Inquisition in the 1540s. Further information, and again, I'm going to stop sharing and go back. I'm sorry again. Further information on the conversos' apocalyptic beliefs can be gleaned from Juan de Toledo's testimonies. On several occasions, the Morisco recalled that Felipe de Nájera often talked about the fate of the lost tribes of Israel, a theme that was also elaborated in Bandarras's trovas. The converso doctor spoke of not 10, but rather of 9.5 tribes of Israel. He claimed to be the descendant of one of those tribes, the tribe of Zebulun, to which Juan de Toledo, this Morisco, laughed heartily at the sound of this name. According to the Morisco, Nájera indignantly responded that he should not laugh, since they were God's elected people who would be redeemed at the end of times. Furthermore, Nájera claimed that the 9.5 tribes lived, and I quote, in a place called the Enclosed Town, El Pueblo Cerrado, which was supposed to be located in the lands of the Grand Turk, where Enoch and Elias live. Here we find echoes of the Islamic narrative of the Alexander romance, the account of the life and exploits of Alexander the Great, so well known in Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Arabic, and Hebrew lore. According to the Islamic version, Alexander built a wall against the nations of Gog and Magog, Yajuj wa Majuj, which at times were associated with the Turks, who would remain enclosed until the advent of the end times, when they would fight the Mahdi, the eschatological redeemer in Islam. In the Old French version, Gog and Magog would remain enclosed until the advent of the Antichrist. But back to our story, Nájera assured the Morisco that, quote, the tribes would one day reemerge led by the two prophets, end quote. According to Nájera, this information was confirmed by two prophecies that stated that the Jews who lived in the enclosed town would appear with a great empire, and that they, the Jews, would be led by a monarch who would prevail in conquering the Iberian Peninsula. Conflating the political aspirations of Conversos with that of another group of subjects of the Spanish monarchs, the Portuguese, who had been under the rule of the Castilian king since the 1580s, Nájera declared that Portugal would have a new king. Once again, this echoes the popular interpretations of Bandarras's prophecies. Nájera also cited another curious prognostication that stated that the Portuguese conversos who arrived in the region of Castile used to cross a river where at the top of a canyon lived an old hermit who was said to be either the prophet Elijah or the prophet Enoch. The Morisco testified before the inquisitors that he had heard Nájera state that the 9.5 tribes of Israel would soon gather at that site because he knew that the area would be conquered. But who would conquer the peninsula, presumably at the end of times? Nájera stated that if the French and the Sultan of Morocco and the English came to the Iberian Peninsula, they would cause great harm upon Spain, which would be lost. It was also possible that the peninsula would be conquered by the Ottomans. At this, according to Nájera, was predicted in the prophecies of the 6th, 7th century scholar, Saint Isidore of Seville. So again, we have here a very large scenario with prophecies of Bandarra, with prophecies about the 9.5 or 10 tribes of Israel that would be liberated before the end of times. We have here the French, we have the English, we have the Sultan of Morocco, possibly the Ottomans, all coming to liberate the tribes of Israel and also to conquer the Iberian Peninsula, okay? And again, they are drawing from different sources, and now the last source that is, according to Nájera, alluded to is these very famous prophecies of Saint Isidore of Seville, which predict the destruction of Spain. This message must have resonated with the Morisco Juan de Toledo. As my recently published book shows, prophecies and prognostications concerning the end times were popular among certain groups of Moriscos throughout the 16th century. It is relevant to underscore that many prophecies that were circulating among Moriscos precisely during the first decade of the 17th century included the scenario of an eventual conquest of Spain, either by the French, the Moroccan Sultan, the English, or the Ottomans. So here, the Morisco knowledge and the Converso knowledge are converging. In fact, between 1604 and 1608, the inquisitors of Valencia and Aragon were investigating a Morisco rebellion plot in which some Morisco notables attempted to communicate with Henry IV, and citing prophecies that projected a messianic status onto the French monarch, augured him victory, but only if he collaborated with the Moriscos. As is well known, the Moriscos' alleged treachery and rebellious intentions served as justification for their eventual expulsion from the peninsula. These prophecies, known as Jofores, were written in Aljamiado, and Aljamiado is the writing of Romance languages in Arabic characters. And they not only predicted a future Muslim victory against the Catholic monarchy, but more importantly, the restoration of Islam in the peninsula as a sign of God's redemption. And I will show you some examples after I finish talking. Like their Converso counterparts, the sources of inspiration of these texts were rooted in biblical narratives, medieval Christian apocalyptic texts, as well as Muslim apocalyptic literature in the form of hadiths, sayings, actions, and tacit approvals of Muhammad. Like Bandarras's verse prognostications and the prophecies of Saint Isidore for the Conversos, these Christian apocalyptic narratives were especially popular among Moriscos because they highlighted the sins and excesses of the Catholic Church and Christian monarchs, and they predicted God's wrath and punishment for Christian sins. In one such text, Saint Isidore warns that the people of Spain will be afflicted and accursed, and Christians will be punished at the hands of Muslims. In another such prophecy, Saint Isidore delivers a harsh invective against Spain, sentencing that it will boil in the passions of its evils and will be consumed by great fires and calamities. Predicting an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, Saint Isidore declares, quote, that the sword of justice will enter you from 5 sides, end quote. After praying to God that the Muslims do not rebel in the Spanish kingdoms, Saint Isidore declares that the renewal of the law will begin following the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. And here I should note that the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 fueled apocalyptic anxieties and expectations among Jews, also Christians, and Muslims around the Mediterranean, since it was viewed as one of the precursors to the final battle of the end of times. In another Alhamiado prophecy, attributed to the 14th century Franciscan monk and alchemist John of Rupesissa, the monk warned that, quote, the Turks and the Greeks will come to destroy the Christian people, end quote, and they will cause great harm throughout Europe. Then they were to strike against the Balearics and the eastern coast of Iberia, engulfing the whole peninsula in their path. This would all take place, quote, because of their ignorance and arrogance, end quote, but above all, on account of the evils of the church, which would be completely destroyed. Spain would be conquered in 42 months at the hands of Antichrist, and Antichrist in this particular Morisco rendition of Saint Isidore's prophecies is known as Fatimi, and only those who possess the sign of the Shahada, the Muslim profession of faith, would be spared. As a direct message to Moriscos, then, the Christians' Antichrist would be their awaited Mahdi, their eschatological redeemer. In this very, very brief intervention, I have presented examples of the circulation of apocalyptic ideas among Moriscos and Conversos. These examples are interesting on several levels. On the one hand, read together, the information contained in the Inquisition trial record and the Alhamiado texts show that Moriscos and Conversos not only shared similar apocalyptic ideas, but that in addition to drawing eschatological knowledge from the religion of their forefathers, they fully incorporated Christian prophecies into their apocalyptic repertoire. On the other hand, the Inquisition record offers rare glimpses into some of the ways in which the information concerning the end of times might have been transmitted among the new Christians in the unexpected space of a jail cell. I would like to end this talk by reflecting on an issue that I alluded to in the beginning, and is this question of fuzziness. In the first decade of the 21st century, the topic of mestizaje or syncretism, particularly as it pertains to the study of interconfessional interactions, such as we see in the medieval and early modern Iberia and the Mediterranean, became popular among historians. I see this as a pretty direct response to the trauma of 9/11, where historians aimed at highlighting commonalities between all 3 Abrahamic religions in the face of the strong Islamophobic backlash that followed the attacks. The well-intentioned efforts notwithstanding, the fuzzy paradigm in which confessional lines were blurred, or in which confessional affiliation seems ambiguous, in my opinion, strips historical subjects of any political agency. Let me give you an example by the very important historian and towering figure, I should say, Natalie Zeman Davis, who worked so much on this topic. In a symposium on fuzzy studies that was later published in the journal Common Knowledge in 2011-2012, Natalie Zeman Davis asserted that, quote, the boundaries around any one of these groups are often fuzzy and porous, even while the people at its center may be insisting on a sharp difference between us and them, end quote. I want to focus on this quote because I think it's at the heart of what I have argued in my recent book, and which has very much to do with the deployment of apocalyptic discourses in the early modern period. I want to argue that while it may be tempting to analyze the examples that I mentioned today, the rereadings of Banderas's prophecies by Conversos, or the re-elaborations of the pseudo-Isidorian prophetic narratives by Conversos and Moriscos in terms of syncretism or fuzziness, that is, that the Converso and Morisco prophecies are the product of a culture that was neither fully Jewish, Islamic, or Christian. The deployment of these prophecies exhibit great dexterity on the part of these historical subjects in adopting a Christian prophetic voice and subverting it to address their own communal concerns. In other words, we see in these Converso and Morisco adaptations of the Christian prophetic corpus processes of intellectual and cultural exchange and appropriation at play. Yet this very use of prophecies for political and polemical purposes also reveals the fraught relations between all three ethno-religious groups. Moriscos and Conversos were deploying apocalyptic texts in order to define their own communities, and in that sense, the invocation of eschatological discourses with its promises of retribution and redemption threatened to explode as social violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for such an inspiring and interesting talk. I guess that everybody is really glad to hear that, and I'm particularly glad to know that you were interested in feedback, so maybe we can have a very nice and productive discussion. Well, I invite anyone who has questions to either use the raise hand function or type a question in the chat box. So all questions are very welcome. Someone's raising the hand, just a second. Yes, Lucilipi, please.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is regarding the idea of I agree with you that the idea of fuzziness or just mixing everything in a melting pot is sometimes counterproductive. But I was wondering, in which sense do you think that the idea of fuzziness and hybridism or mestizaje are the same thing? You know, and I ask you that because, for instance, if one reads Nachten-Wachtel propositions or Gruzinski's propositions, for instance, they're not stating that the fuzziness as a state of things, that it's not quite clear whatever element is more important or more significant. They're saying, I guess, on the other hand, that actually the process of mestizaje or hybridization is the output of those encounters. So I guess there are two different approaches of the same problem. I don't agree with. I think both approaches are really problematic because they in a way they do not highlight the conflicts or the difference, or as you well put it, the look for identity or building some identity traces or to define themselves towards something. But anyhow, when I hear you is if you see any difference, as I'm saying, between the idea of fusiness and the idea of mestizaje or hybridism.
Okay, that's a good question, and thank you for the question, and thank you for forcing me to make a difference, because I think it's very important when it comes to Moriscos. Really, the idea of mestizaje isn't very much used, but rather this idea of either this syncretic type of religious beliefs, or most recently, this idea of fuzziness. And I'm deeply troubled by this idea of fuzziness, in particular because it assumes, and this, as I was reading, and I admire, and I should say that I really do admire the work of Natalie Zeman Davis tremendously, but here I was kind of puzzled in the way that she said, let me see if I can find the quote again, where she is saying that her subjects might not have been aware that they were, fuzzy, even if they assert their identity, they might not be aware. And I'm very deeply troubled by that, particularly in the way that Moriscos use and deploy prophecies, because when they, and I should say, and I should be very careful with this, that when I'm talking about Moriscos, we can't talk about one group of Moriscos, but rather there are many different kinds of Moriscos. And when I'm talking about Morisco ideas, apocalyptic ideas, I'm talking about those Moriscos who saw themselves as Muslim and who deployed prophecies in order to assert a Muslim identity. And here we see very clearly that the Moriscos weren't confused, or their ideas about themselves and their religion wasn't fuzzy at all. On the contrary, they were deploying these texts for very political purposes, to define themselves and to try to gain support from outside. And I see in this case, and I was very surprised rereading this Inquisition case, that at least this converso, Felipe de Nájera, is using or is deploying or is invoking these apocalyptic ideas in very similar ways. There is very much a political discourse that Nájera is deploying here. And it is very much an assertion of, or a hope for the redemption of the Jewish people, right? And in that sense, he's presenting himself very much as a Jew. And it doesn't matter what this is not fuzziness. What I think the operation that is taking place here is drawing from the other's discourse to confirm what you already know that God or your prophet has predicted about this, the end of times. So in that sense, the Christian apocalyptic ideas are not flawed, but rather they come to confirm their own ideas about the end times. It is a discourse that is shared between the three Abrahamic faiths, but I really very uncomfortable with the idea of fuzziness. So I'm going to leave the mestizaje part out of my answer and just focus on this question of syncretism and of particularly of fuzziness. And I bring in this question of fuzziness because it has been used to think about the ways in which Moriscos and Conversos draw from Christian apocalyptic ideas and re-elaborate them. And so what I'm trying to argue is that we need to stay away from those kinds of interpretations, because when it comes to prophecy and apocalyptic ideas, what we're seeing is the complete opposite. So here it's not that as, and I'm trying to find it, wait a second. It's not as Natalie Zeman-Davis says, that the groups groups are often fuzzy and porous, even while the people at its center may be insisting on a sharp difference between us and them. It's that the discourse itself is being deployed very consciously in order to, in a way, assert a particular identity, to claim something. So it's not a fuzzy, porous, confused thing, but rather a use of discourse in a very deliberate political way. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the argument that I'm trying to make. And I don't know if the argument is actually convincing or not, Luis Felipe. You can tell me if you think that you're convinced or not.
Thank you, Professor. Luis Felipe, do you want to add something? Or
I think that there is someone who
yes.
So,
but I'm only asking if you want to add a follow-up, or we can move to the next question.
I was thinking, because I don't know much about Moriscos. I'm thinking, especially in terms of new Christians and Judaizers and things like that, or the gente de nação, the Jewish, Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, and I think that actually was my point. That we think in terms of when we talk about hybridization, or more specific term mestizaje, or the idea of Marronism as defended by Vartel, I think that we miss a point, a huge point. That is, those communities, they define themselves as communities, and specific communities, and we are trying to understand their identities in terms of our understanding of identity. There's a general, usually national, broader sense of identity, and they are working with a very specific process of identification. So the idea of patria chica, so this is my place, this is my community, my specific community, and they have on the top of that very more broader notions of identity, of community, as Christendom, Islam, Israel, things that are so broad, so vast, so big. That's not our identity, even in terms of our religious identities nowadays. The very concept of religion is a 19th century concept, for instance. So I think so I agree with you. Fuzziness is, I don't know if it's a productive concept, productive category to explain early modern identities, specifically in the Iberian-American world. So I agree with you. I think you have a point.
I think at this point, and for this particular paper, I've dedicated a lot of time to thinking about this question among Moriscos, but I think it would possibly be, or what I'm trying to get at is to do the same thing with the Conversos, and then try to look at them together, because this is another thing about this project that I think is exciting. And it's that Moriscos and Conversos, as you know, have usually been studied separately. And this is really an opportunity to look at them together and to think about their uses and deployment of apocalyptic discourse together, and see where they are different, where there are commonalities, etc. So again, the challenge that I have is that right now I am starting to work on this project, drawing from this single Inquisition case. And so it'll be important not just to look at these discourses, again, separately among Moriscos and Conversos, but to try to find other cases where we have Moriscos and Conversos talking about this stuff, you know? And if I manage to do that, then that'll be really exciting. And I think I will be able to make a stronger case. I know that right now the argument seems kind of fuzzy because I am focusing on this single Inquisition case. But I think that's where that would be a very productive way of moving the conversation forward, would be to look at more interactions like this. And again, I was actually I started reading, I read Mercedes Garcia Neral's book, 2006 book on Messianism and, I can't remember what it was titled, wait, Messianism and Puritanical, what was it? Messianism and Puritanical, oh my God, I can't believe that I forgot, but you know the book that I'm referring to. And she has a section at the last chapter is dedicated to Moriscos, and she discusses also Conversos and Jews. Again, the discussion is done more in terms of looking at the sources that each group is drawing from, but there isn't an attempt, Messianism and Puritanical reform, thank you, of looking at the ways in which these two groups are talking about this stuff together and to each other. So I believe that she mentioned some cases about Iberian Jewish communities that end up in North Africa, and in particular in Morocco, who are also making reference to Christian prophecies and all the prophecies that Moriscos are also making reference to. So it would be really interesting to maybe look at sources from North Africa to see if Moriscos who flee and Jews who are there are also talking about this stuff. So there is more research to be done for sure. And I think the idea of studying these groups together is exciting.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we have Amina Lina, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Amina Boukail from Algeria, assistant professor in Arabic literature. I will do thank you very much, Professor Mercado, for your conference and for your book. I used very much your book, Vision and Deliverance.
Oh, nice.
And, I work on Moriscos heritage in Algeria, especially in Algeria, with this continuity, Moriscos and Jewish in Algeria. And I have a question. My question, Professor, please. I want to know if there is the image or representation of Salvador or Savior in narrative Moriscos. The image of like Al-Mahdi,
Yes, certainly.
Like Mahdi, if there is any representation text, please.
Yes, there certainly is. Most Al-Hamiado prophecies mention or make reference to a redeemer that can be associated with the Mahdi. Usually the term used in these narratives is Fatimi, and not Mahdi, but it's synonymous, as we know.
Yes.
So I have an article that I published, I think it was in 2012, where there is, that I have been able to trace one case in which one Morisco actually identifies or is identified as Fatimi. But there are several narratives. I mentioned, and maybe here would be a good time if I didn't close this, which I did, but wait a second.
Okay.
Just a second. Let me show you. So in this re-elaboration of the prophecy of Isidore of Seville, of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is a prophecy attributed to, again, a prophecy attributed to Isidore of Seville. It is, and also in this one, the prophecy of John of Rupesissa, they are prophecies adapted by Moriscos, but they still take on a Christian voice. And there, in these two texts, there is reference to quote unquote Antichrist, but the Antichrist in these prophecies, who will come and punish Christians, is known as Fatimi. Okay, so here there is a really interesting sort of subversion going on. And then if you look at the texts, which I include in the book translations, and the translations themselves are super difficult because the texts in Spanish that we have are super difficult. There are references to a redeeming figure, but in those texts, I argue that the Mahdi is associated with the Ottomans, okay? And then when we look at Inquisition cases, we see many references of Moriscos making reference to a redeeming figure. And there, again, they don't use the term, the Inquisition sources don't use the term Mahdi, but we do see the term Fatimi used, okay? And so there's definitely very specific references on the part of Moriscos to a figure that we can associate with the Mahdi. Okay. And and it's really interesting because this figure will come at the end of times, and there will be a battle basically at the end of times in which the Mahdi will come basically to restore justice in order to the world before the end of times, okay? Yes. Which is, we also see it in other type of hadith literature as well. So yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why, for me, these texts are used very deliberately in political ways, and that when these texts are deployed, Moriscos are very much trying to present themselves as Muslims, or the Moriscos who deploy these texts are trying to present themselves as Muslim. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to being in touch with you. I think I saw you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think I saw you either last week or the week before in that conference that Professor Alejandro Garcia San Juan gave in Tunis.
Yes.
So you asked
Moriscos, of course. Where is Moriscos? Unity of Moriscos. Thank you very much. I help see your book in Arabic, because in Arab world now we gave very importance the Moriscos heritage now. Very important.
You know, that's actually a very wonderful suggestion. I always thought that the book would be translated into Spanish. But I would actually absolutely love to have the book translated into Arabic. Yeah. Yes, and I'm very much looking forward to reading more of the work that North African scholars are doing on Moriscos, because it's actually very, very important work that is being done in Arabic right now by North African scholars who have access to sources that have not been looked at by Spanish scholars or scholars in North America or Europe. So this is actually very exciting to see collaborations between North African scholars and scholars in other places.
Okay.
I look forward to talking to you more.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Amina, for your question. Does anyone wants to add something or make a question? Because I have questions as well.
I actually have a question to see if anyone can give feedback. Has anyone come across this this image of first the 9.5 tribes, and second this idea of the 9.5 tribes living in the east, sort of close to the Caspian, and then being liberated, and that they will serve in the armies of the Messiah, basically? No. So this is, I know that Professor Garcia Arenal does have a reference that that I think is from a text from a North African Jew, or an Iberian Jew living in North Africa. But this is something that I haven't really seen too much. The trope appears in, oh, interesting. So what is how does it appear?
So I'm sorry, I was in doubt if I should just raise the hand or type, but it appears with, it's very interesting as well. And I really liked to watch your discussion with Professor Luis Felipe on the matter of identity and all that, because my PhD is about identity construction, like I said, on the case of the diggers, and they mobilize so many tropes and so many millenarian and apocalyptic themes, and also and it's very interesting because they also construct this othering that you mentioned as this way of trying to differentiate in a very fuzzy way, because at the same time that they are being perceived with this big collective of other radicals or groups in during the civil wars, they are trying to make this differentiation more clear. But at the same time that they advocate for this construction, and they also always refer to themselves as the descendants of the tribes and the saints of God and all that, but they also speak in terms of universal salvation, which is quite interesting for the period. So it's that fine line between, they do draw this identity of, this certain people that is going to be elected, and they draw this idea of those people that don't follow the word of God. They are going to suffer for a while, but then they're going to be eventually saved, which is, they say it's not the purgatory, but they describe it in terms of being almost like a imagined purgatory. So the trope of the 9 tribes usually appears with this reinforcement of their relation to them and being chosen by God, but I've never seen them. I haven't yet, at least, come across any sources where they make such an approach, such a reading of it, as in them coming back and fighting and being in the East. It's always more like a theme, a reference, something that they relate to. But it's very interesting to see how a trope is utilized in so many varied ways in the period and in different places in Europe, and it's very interesting.
Thank you. I will follow up on that reference, but yeah, it's something that I think, as I said, I know that in Messianism and Puritanical Reform, there is a very specific reference to the 9.5 tribes in this messianic context, but it's interesting. To me, reading this Inquisition case was just so interesting. The thought that this Morisco and this Converso are together in a jail cell. The Morisco starts reciting the Bandarras' trovas to the inquisitors, and the inquisitors are writing it down. So he remembered the poems that the Converso is telling him, and then he goes and recites them to the inquisitors. This is just really, really unique and fascinating. And it kind of really makes us think about the ways in which these ideas circulate, and really in unexpected places. So it's I just think that this case is singular But I'm hoping that as Eduardo Grendi proposes sort of the exceptional normal, and that this will allow me to say more about the ways in which these ideas circulated between different groups. Yeah, Luis Felipe.
Yes, please.
I was thinking two things. There are not actually connections in this sense you are proposing here, but it would be interesting to compare the different versions or even appropriations of pseudo Isidore or pseudo Roquetayad, Rupessis, Roquetayava, Rocacelsa. Because it's quite for the first time when I read the transcript of the version of the Morisco version of Rupessis, I was, oh my God, I read several times this written in Portuguese in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and now it is it's a 15th century manuscript. Yes.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly. I actually didn't know that it circulated widely in Portugal.
Yeah, it was one of the most important sources for Sebastianism from the 17th century on.
Oh, wow. That's super fascinating. So, actually, you're right. It would be really interesting to do a comparison between all of these. Yeah, I tried to do it with the Isidorian corpus, but I read the Rupesisa and the Morisco text, but it's fascinating to know that it circulated also in Portugal and that it influenced Sebastianismo. That's really great. I remember doing a little bit of research in Portugal many years ago, and the one prophecy that I saw a lot was Isidore's. It was everywhere. You see it in tons and tons of manuscripts, but Rupesisa, that's fascinating. That's really cool.
Well, I have some questions as well. I don't know if they are really useful to you, Professor, but they are certainly for me. But while I was listening to you, and you mentioned that one of the people involved in the case remember other reciting the thing and the texts, and I was thinking about all the circulation of knowledge and the material forms of this circulation between like the oral communication, texts, both in manuscript or maybe print, images, and all of that. How this network and all this repertoire of apocalyptic issues were circulating through this all very broad and vast communication circuit. What are your thoughts on that, on this material aspect, actually?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. For the Moriscos, which is what I know more of, there were written texts that circulated, but the way in which these texts circulated the most was that, and I analyze this in the context of rebellion conspiracies, Moriscos would gather together in secret, of course, particularly during Friday prayer, and these texts would be read out loud, okay? And then once they were read out loud, they were commented on by people who were present in the meeting. And then we see, mostly from Inquisition sources, the ways in which Moriscos are commenting on these prophecies with their neighbors. So there is a material dimension to these prophecies. We have the texts. We don't have too many surviving copies of these in Alhamiado, but we do have many testimonies in which we see Moriscos, mostly this knowledge circulating orally. And again, this Inquisition case kind of gives us an idea of possible ways in which this knowledge was transmitted between Moriscos and Conversos. Oh, thank you for writing this. I will read this in a little bit. And so this is, I think this is very much an oral phenomenon, but of course we also have texts, and the texts must have been very important and valuable for the communities involved, especially because they were read out loud as parts of sermons during Friday prayer. Okay, so that's really interesting that our Inquisition sources, even though they're super problematic, still give us a sense of the ways in which this material might have circulated. And then for this particular case of Nájera, he was from the same town as Bandarra. So he must have been hearing this, and this is poetry. So, you know, you memorize it and then you recite it or sing them, you know. So that's really interesting.
Thank you, Professor. Does anyone has any questions?
So I will, Luis
Lívia,
Felipe, I will get that reference that you just gave. Thank you.
As we have time, I was very interested by the final comment on your presentation when you mentioned how 9/11 and Islamophobic followed it, influenced the historiography and the studies and all that. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, just because I find it really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually not an idea that I have fully developed. I was just kind of thinking, wait a second, where is all this fuzziness, ideas of fuzziness coming from? Why are people so interested in looking at sort of the trying to find, and I also found myself doing the same thing in my teaching, for example, here in the United States after 9/11. After 9/11, during 9/11, I was just starting my dissertation, and I do think that this interest that we see sort of in 2010, 2011 is sort of that response to 10 horrible years of Islamophobia, at least in North America, but also you see it in Europe as well. And so again, this is an idea that I've been thinking about, that I haven't fully developed, that I don't know if it's fully convincing. And, you know, we could have conversations with people who were writing about fuzziness and ask, you know, what do you think about this? Were you responding to this? But I do see it as a response. And in a way, what ends up happening, in my opinion, is that they end up overcompensating, you know, and I understand where the move is coming from, because I do it in my classes, in my teaching. I try, especially right around the time that the fuzziness issue was taking place, I was teaching at the University of Tennessee, and many of my students were actually soldiers who had just come back, veterans or soldiers who were either coming back from active duty. And I found myself in my classes trying to make my students see the confluences in ideas between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But then again, and I think this was productive in my teaching, and that my students really needed this, but I wonder if it becomes counterproductive when we are using it as a methodological tool of analysis to look at our sources and to analyze our historical subjects. I think that's where I start becoming uncomfortable. But again, I have sort of that theory that I haven't been able to, I haven't really proved, but to me it makes sense as, where is this interest coming from and why the insistence on looking at the parallels and looking at the syncretisms and looking at these subjects in this way. I don't know.
No, yeah, it sounds like a fascinating idea, and I do see. Well, I have never studied Islamic studies or anything like that a lot, but it sounds interesting because I think current events definitely influence historiography, right?
Right. It does, and it influences the way in which people read your work. As I was writing, since I started doing research on my subject, I was always worried about looking at Morisco political culture and the use of apocalyptic prophecies, because I was worried that this subject in a way would be read in a presentist kind of way. And it actually did happen to me on several occasions where I presented my work and people would say things like, okay, so what does this have to do with ISIS? And I would be like, absolutely nothing. This has nothing to do with ISIS. Or what, I think we can, as historians, we are influenced by, current ideas. And even if we're not aware of it, we end up bringing it into, our work. But that we shouldn't impose, we should be very careful with, especially when talking about identity, imposing ideas that really don't necessarily have to do with the past, but rather concerns that are taking place today. Yeah. And I was actually, someone suggested to me that I should address that issue in the introduction to my book. And I said, no, because I don't want to put ideas in people's head, This has nothing to do with what I'm interested in, which is really to recover, instead of looking at Moriscos as a vanquished community, I'm more interested in trying to recover Morisco agency and the use of apocalyptic discourses allows me to do that, because the prophecies that I'm looking at are very much used in political contexts.
Thank you, Professor. Well, we have time for one or two questions. So if anyone wants to pose anything, now is the time.
We are looking at you, Luis Felipe.
You said you had plenty of questions, so do it.
Yeah, one thing is that I really think we should, as it was the goal at that seminar that I wasn't able to attend. To see this in connected perspective, because right. For me, I think that's for instance the Rupasesa corpus is one example among many of this kind of cross-reference. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we usually don't do is to understand or to analyze those sources, seeing what is the difference between this group reading against that
exactly
reading.
You're right, you're definitely right.
So and I think that we miss a really important point of understanding Iberian, so to speak, apocalypticism, messianism, or millenarianism, if we don't do that.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, and I think that Rupsisa, the pseudo Isidore Bandarra's prophecies, and so on. So this is not a question. It's more like it's a comment that I think that should be a project, a research project, or at least a research goal for us that study Apocalyptic.
I should say that in that conference, everyone except for me, I think, decided that we shouldn't look at this in terms of connected histories, because they argued that this was mainly references to texts, but that we couldn't establish actual connections between people, which I, again, disagreed, because this is precisely what I tried to do. But I think you're completely right that the proposal that Sanjay Subrahmanyam gave us more than 20 years ago is extremely valuable, and that I think that it's been extremely important for the study of the early modern period, but that it can actually, it's a very productive type of analysis for different periods, not just for the early modern period, and that you can, but it really entails very meticulous work to really try to find these connections. Because when you look at the textual, then yes, they were reading the same things. Yes, they were talking about the same things. But when you start doing the work of trying to connect the people and how they thought about it, is when you really can understand what they really thought, or how they really used these types of prophecies. So I think connected histories is the way of looking at this particular phenomenon. I think it's super productive and super important work to do, but the problem with connected histories is that it requires a level of training in languages and broad history that many people can't do or don't do, right? And so it's difficult to do connected histories, but I think it's super productive and super important. And it forces one to move between, as Sanjay Subrahmanyam says, between micro history and macro history constantly, I think it's super productive. I think that more work like that needs to be done, not just focusing on texts, but trying to look at the actors and how they're using the texts. But yeah, I completely agree. But yeah, as I remember at the very end of that conference, I was like, what are we talking about? Of course you can do connected histories of apocalypticism. So yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Well, due to the time, I guess we have to end this really interesting conversation, but it was a pleasure to receive you, Professor. I'm really thankful to that. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thanks everyone that stayed during the debate. I will also like to invite everyone to attend the next session, which will be on the 22nd June. We will receive Dr. Michael Bennett from the University of Sheffield, who will talk about English merchants, the Brazilian sugar trade, and the rise of Caribbean plantation economies in the 17th century. So everyone is invited. And well, hope to see you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here, for the questions, and for inviting me. This was really, really exciting. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor.